The root causes, which we can get to, and I have lots of ideas and thoughts on it. If you want to get into the weeds of like, what are the exact causes, we can talk about that. But the thing that people have not opened their eyes to is the science of what we call metabolism or metabolic health. And what I ultimately am arguing, the easiest way for me to put it, is that what I'm arguing is that mental health conditions, the chronic serious ones in which the brain isn't functioning properly, brain disorders that are causing mental health symptoms, those are the things I'm talking about now. Those, in fact, are metabolic disorders affecting the brain. And so the easiest way to understand why do we see skyrocketing rates of mental illness, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing those skyrocketing rates at the same time that we see skyrocketing rates of obesity, overweight, diabetes, and prediabetes, which are also metabolic conditions. That all of those things are rising simultaneously. And that the brain is an organ. And so some people can have metabolic problems, and some people can be thin and still have a metabolic problem. So I'm not at all saying that obesity is the only driver, because a lot of times people think about it in that way. So are you saying obesity comes first and then everybody gets a mental illness? No, I'm not saying it that way. Sometimes the mental illness starts first because it's a manifestation of metabolic dysfunction in the brain. And it basically means the brain isn't working right. And so somebody might have unrelenting depression or unexplainable anxiety or psychotic symptoms or bipolar symptoms or eating disorder symptoms or substance use disorder symptoms, that they may have symptoms, but all of those things are a manifestation of metabolic dysfunction in the brain. The easiest way to explain it is that our bodies and our brains are made up of cells. And all of our cells need two essential things to function properly. They need food, oxygen. Those are the big ones that most people know. It gets much more complicated fast because food contains all sorts of nutrients. So we need certain vitamins and nutrients, and hormones are playing a role. All sorts of things are playing a role. But at the end of the day, that's what metabolism is. Metabolism is taking food and oxygen and keeping us alive. They are fundamental to our health, but also the function of our cells. And when something goes wrong in that process, and there are lots of things that can go wrong, when something goes wrong with taking food and oxygen and turning it into energy, the cell can malfunction. And when it happens in your brain, it means that your brain can malfunction. And the way that we know the brain is malfunctioning are all of the symptoms of mental illness. When somebody has depression for no good reason, when somebody has anxiety for no good reason, when somebody just has experiences like hallucinations or delusions for no good reason, that all of those things represent the brain malfunctioning.
If you could take me one step deeper into this idea of, food and oxygen being converted into energy in the cell, something goes wrong there. What goes wrong? Why does it go wrong?
So the real answer is it's extraordinarily complicated. There are many pathways in metabolism. There are many things that play a role. But the easiest way to understand it and the way to unify it, the helpful insight, the immensely helpful insight, and this is new cutting edge information. Most people don't know this. But there are these tiny things in our cells called mitochondria. And they are actually the primary sites in our cells that food and oxygen are getting converted into energy or building blocks for our cells. When you do a deep dive into the science of mitochondria, you can actually begin to understand what's happening in the brains and bodies of people with mental illness. And you can begin to understand all of these very complicated things, like why would neurotransmitters become imbalanced? Like what's causing a neurotransmitter imbalance, if there even is one? What's causing a hormone imbalance? What's causing higher levels of inflammation in the brains and bodies of people with metabolic and mental disorders? What about the gut microbiome? How does that play a role? But what about stress and trauma? Psychological stress, trauma. How do those things fit in? Mitochondria are actually the scientific way to begin to connect all of those dots and to help us understand why the brains of some people, quote unquote, malfunction, or why they are dysregulated, might be a better way to put it, or why some people can't seem to, quote unquote, get over it, get over a trauma, or get over a breakup with someone. What's going on? Why aren't they more resilient? Why can't they pull it together? Mitochondrial dysfunction, as nerdy and sciencey as that is, can help us connect the dots. If that trauma is not resolved, so for some people, they can experience a trauma. They can be quite effective at mitigating it and move on with their life. Somebody could get into a fight. Somebody could get mugged on the street. They're just walking down the street. Somebody pulls a knife on them or a gun on them and wants to rob them. If somebody manages that trauma highly effectively, let's say you happen to have a black belt in karate and you disarm your assailant very quickly and rapidly, you may not think twice about the trauma. You may actually be emboldened after that traumatic event and think, I'm quite effective and skilled. Wow, those karate classes really came in handy. And I'm quite powerful, and maybe even feel a little more confident than you normally would.
And that's the interpretation element, right, of the situation. So two people could be in the same situation, but have...
So that person still had the same physiological reactions, a gun in your face, or wherever. That person's glucose was going up, their heart rate was going up, all of those metabolic changes were occurring. But so that's a success story. And that's probably a resilient person who moves on and never thinks twice about that trauma, or rarely thinks about it and thinks about it with pride if they do think about it. In the case where it doesn't go well at all, let's leave the extreme out where the person is murdered. Let's leave something less severe than that. But the person is beaten. They are injured severely. They are terrified to go out in public for fear that there could be another one just like that. That person, their fight or flight system is not turning off. Their fight or flight system is now on, at least at a low level, possibly a very high level, for a very prolonged period of time. They are now afraid of the world. Immediately after that type of horrific assault, they are now afraid of the world. They probably aren't sleeping as well. And what's happening physiologically, and we know this, is that those higher cortisol levels are actually causing something called hypermetabolism. Their mitochondria are actually working on overtime because the body is still primed for the world is unsafe. Everything is unsafe. Maybe that person who assaulted me is going to somehow figure out where I live and come through that door any minute. So you're sleeping at night and you hear a sound or you hear a creak and you panic and you wake up and you're startled and you're terrified. Or you sleep at night and you have a nightmare and you wake up and you're reliving that experience and just you're horrified and overwhelmed again.
Is this conscious? Because, often you
No.
speak to people with severe anxiety and they have panic attacks and they don't know why they're having panic attacks. They can't name something that they're scared of or a fear they have.
No, this is not at all conscious. So at this point, in the week or two after a horrific trauma like I've described, I would argue this is not a disorder. This is not the brain malfunctioning. This isn't the body malfunctioning. The brain and body are doing precisely what they are programmed to do: protect you. Your life is in danger. Why? Because somebody just tried to take it and they were close. They came close to taking your life. They could have killed you. And so your body and brain are trying to protect you. Unfortunately, that comes at a cost. All of this energy going toward the defense system means that energy that should be going toward maintaining your cells is actually being bypassed sometimes. So we know this. So for example, there are these things called stress granules, where cells that are trying to just do basic ho-hum everyday repair work, create some new proteins or new receptors or do some cleanup work. The code for those, which are called messenger RNAs, actually gets sequestered in these little bubbles called stress granules. And what that means is that they're not getting done. The messages are starting from your DNA because the cell is saying, hey, I need some repair work over here. Send some new proteins over here to do some repair work. When your body is in fight or flight mode, those messages actually get interrupted. And that means, bottom line, it means that when you feel threatened, your body is diverting metabolic resources toward your self-defense system. Hypervigilance. Be ready to run at any minute. Be ready to fight off the offender at any minute. You cannot feel safe. Don't feel safe. When that goes on for a prolonged period of time, your cells can fall into a state of disrepair because metabolic resources are not going towards cell maintenance. If that occurs long enough or in a severe enough way, it means that some of your cells can now fall into a state of disrepair and they can begin to malfunction. When that happens, if it's happening in brain cells, that's when I would say the person has crossed the line from a normal survival reaction to trauma. If their cells in their brain begin to malfunction now because they are on a state of disrepair, that can turn into what we call a mental illness. And that means that maybe they can't remember like they used to. It means that maybe, and now they can't pay attention like they used to. Now somebody might say, hey, maybe you've got some ADHD going on. Or their anxiety pathways become what's called hyper-excitable. And now their anxiety pathways are being triggered even when they shouldn't be triggered. And out of the blue, they're having panic attacks or anxiety symptoms. They can be sitting in the comfort of their own home, not thinking any scary thoughts, not watching anything on television or anything that's really disturbing. And out of the blue, they can just be overwhelmed with a panic attack. And that person, I would say, if they have a panic attack for no reason, that person's brain is now malfunctioning. It is dysregulated. And I would say that person has now crossed over into what I would call a mental disorder, where their brain is, in fact, malfunctioning now. The great news, the hope, and we can get to more of it, is that those cells can be repaired. we can fix that. We can do something about that. The person does not need to be like that forever. This notion that they now have a chemical imbalance that they were probably genetically predisposed to, and now we've got to just medicate them for the rest of their life. I don't agree with that. I'm not at all opposed to medication. If medications can be helpful to that person, 100%, let's use them. Let's help that person heal and recover. But I want to go deeper. I want to understand what is happening in that person's brain and body using this kind of information about metabolism and mitochondria, and how can we effectively help them heal and repair and recover. So diet is huge. And most people have no clue that diet plays any role in mental illness or mental health. 95% of mental health clinicians think it's laughable that anybody would suggest that diet can play a role in mental illness. They think it's laughable.
What do you think?
I think if you do a deep dive into the science, all of the science that we have accumulated over the last 100 years and longer sometimes, that if you do a deep dive into all of those neuroimaging studies that we've been doing, all of the genetic studies we've been doing, all of the neurotransmitter and hormone studies and trauma studies and adverse childhood experiences studies, if you do a deep dive into the science and you understand what is happening in the brains and bodies of people as a consequence of those things, or what could be causing those things, if you put it all together, you come to this soundbite that mental disorders are metabolic in nature. And there is no questioning whatsoever. It is incontrovertible that diet plays a massive, huge role in metabolism. And therefore, I believe very strongly that diet might be playing a role in the mental health epidemic that we are seeing. And it also might provide an avenue of hope and healing and recovery. And I use the word might as the scientist in me, as the clinician in me. I know without certainty it can heal and recover people who have had chronic, horrible, debilitating mental illnesses. And I know from my own personal story, when I was in medical school and residency, I'm still suffering from low-grade depression, OCD, other symptoms. But I also developed what's called metabolic syndrome. I developed high blood pressure, high cholesterol, pre-diabetes, and I wasn't really overweight. I was exercising, I was following a low-fat diet, mostly of processed foods because they're cheaper, but that was the diet that was touted as a healthy diet. It was low in fat. And as long as it was low in fat, that was supposed to be good for us. And my metabolic syndrome just kept getting worse and worse. And so at some point, in order to treat my metabolic syndrome, I changed my diet to essentially a low carbohydrate diet. And within 3 months, my metabolic syndrome was completely gone. But the thing that just dumbfounded me was that my mental health was better than it had ever been in my entire life. And I just couldn't believe what I was experiencing. I didn't know that I could be that kind of a person. I didn't know that I could be happy and positive and energetic and confident. I had no idea. I didn't think that was in me. And by changing my diet, all of those things happened.
The ketogenic diet does many, many things. It's like a multi-purpose tool for brain health. So one thing it does, because we talked about how some of the root causes of mental illnesses, which are only relatively recently a focus of research, are inflammation and oxidative stress and insulin resistance. The ketogenic diet reduces inflammation, it reduces oxidative stress, and it reduces insulin resistance. It also improves the balance of chemicals in the brain. So a lot of people think of mental illnesses as problems with chemical imbalances in the brain. And these are the chemicals that they're talking about. You might have heard of serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine. There are others, glutamate, GABA. Many different chemicals in the brain are associated with, or in some cases, even very much causing mental health symptoms. But the question is, what's causing those chemical imbalances in the first place? And one of the things that's causing those chemical imbalances is that inflammation and oxidative stress. But another thing is that the brain is, if you're feeding it the wrong way, it will not be able to, in many cases, produce energy reliably. And if it can't produce energy reliably, all kinds of things will go wrong, and in quite spectacular fashion. What actually goes wrong is going to depend on who you are. And that's where our individual differences come in. So if you and I eat exactly the same bad diet, depending on what runs in your family and how you've lived your life to this point, you might develop Alzheimer's disease, you might develop bipolar disorder, you might develop type 2 diabetes, you might develop fatty liver disease. I might develop completely different conditions. I might develop cardiovascular disease. I might develop depression. I might develop ADHD. And that's where the individual differences are. But all of these conditions are just metabolic malfunction, really, at the heart of it. That's what's going on. If cells aren't functioning properly, you will develop a disease, physical and mental diseases. And which ones you get, it's really kind of luck of the draw. But you have tremendous control over what you are at risk for if you understand how to help your cells operate at their personal best. This was the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. Albert Denault. He's a psychiatrist who's been practicing in Toulouse, France for more than 35 years. So after witnessing a young family member, someone in his extended family, with autism and seizures improve within weeks of adopting a ketogenic diet, he thought, well, I wonder if this diet could help my patients, especially my patients who are not responding to anything else that I have tried to help them. Psychotherapy, medications, hospitalization. And so he invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with bipolar disorder, major depression, or schizophrenia to come into the hospital and voluntarily try a very mildly ketogenic whole foods diet in the hospital under his supervision to see whether or not they would respond. And these were folks who, these are all adults. These were people who had been ill for an average of 10 years, some for as long as 30 years. These were people who were taking, when they came into the hospital at the beginning of the study, an average of 5 psychiatric medications, not at all unusual for people with chronic mental illness. And all of them had one or more markers of poor metabolic health, obesity, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, things like that. So these were people with poor metabolic health and poor mental health. And they eagerly came into the hospital to try this intervention because nothing else had helped them. And what was remarkable about what he observed was that of the 31 people, 28 were able to stay on the ketogenic diet for more than 2 weeks, which is what you need to do to start to see benefit. Every single one of them improved, to the point that 43% of them achieved clinical remission from their primary psychiatric treatment-resistant chronic mental illness. And 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medication. And all of them improved metabolically as well. And you do not see results like this in conventional psychiatric care. Yes. The first thing I would like to tell you about is that there were studies, quite a few studies back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s in Europe by a variety of different research teams that explored exactly the question you're asking. And what they did was they placed children with ADHD, some quite severe ADHD, even hospital-level ADHD, and put them on something called a few foods diet. This is, the scientists call it an oligoantigenic diet, which just means it's kind of a low allergen diet. So they removed all of the common culprits and they focus mostly on just a few whole foods and a few extras. So very specifically describing this diet, most of these diets were chicken, lamb, fruits, vegetables, and sometimes they'd throw in some apple juice and margarine because they couldn't use butter because dairy is a common allergen. So, but these were mostly whole foods diets, poultry, red meat, fruits, vegetables, and there were 62 to 82% response rate to these diets, no matter which study you looked at. In some of these studies, there was a 70% cure rate within weeks of changing the diet to a few foods diet. So what does this tell us? It doesn't tell us which foods were the problem. It tells us that food can be the problem. That if you make the right dietary changes, it's possible for children, even with very severe ADHD, to improve within weeks to the point that they no longer qualify for having ADHD anymore.
Because there's a change in the symptoms.
Oh, yes. The children's behavior as rated by parents and teachers and the researchers themselves. I'm very excited to be involved in two brand new studies of the ketogenic diet for ADHD. So one is a ketogenic diet for adults with ADHD and depression that's getting started at Oxford University in 2025. And the other is a study of ketogenic diets for ADHD in adults at the University of Michigan. It's also going to be starting in 2025. We have no data on ketogenic diets in ADHD, but we have good reason to believe, the reason we were able to get funding for these studies is because there's reason to believe that it could be useful. And because when you look at ADHD, you see clues to poor metabolic health. So for example, children with obesity are twice as likely to have ADHD. Obesity is a marker for insulin resistance. Adults with type 2 diabetes are twice as likely to have ADHD. Type 2 diabetes is severe end-stage insulin resistance. And the ketogenic diet is the most effective way to address insulin resistance that we have at our disposal.